Hello, I'm Sora Luxon, and this is lesson number 79, John Dee, Sigils, and Crows, which have nothing to do with each other really directly, unless you maybe use an ideologue of a crow in your sigil work or understand that John Dee, in many ways, especially within the Enochian arts, is seen as one of the great fathers of angelic sigillarium. So there is no introductory discussion for me that's possible about any sort of sigil craft without the recognition and appreciation of the Renaissance magus, John Dee, often called the Londoner, if you want to search it on Google and get a little deeper knowledge than is widely available to the public. Also known as the Ultimass Polymath of the Sixth Age, among adepts of an Augustinian prophecy type leaning or bent, and that's how they conform to their calendars. That would be the Iron Age, or an Iron Age expert, that's John Dee for the anthropologists among us, or perhaps a descended master of the Kali Yuga age, if you're hailing from that background. I think that's correct. I think we're in Kali Yuga. And he would have been as well. It's a very long cycle within the Yuga cycles. The Nazarene, Buddha, Muhammad, I think they would all be avatars within that age as well. Anyway, John Dee's insightful workings into math, the arts, the sciences, and alchemy overall during that great golden age of enlightenment, the Renaissance, is incredibly important as a conversation to have when discussing sigils. And someone was asking me in depth about sigils, and I've been meaning to get around to it, and this is how I'm going to begin exploring that. This is what I feel called to express. That it was John Dee who not only reinvigorated angelology experiments. If this person asked me specifically about traditional formal magics around the Enochian arts, John Dee had conversations with angels. So I can't really discuss the Enochian arts without also mentioning John Dee. That's my hermetic occultist inner self is going to need to say something about that. Especially practitioners of the Golden Dawn ritual magic are going to head in this direction almost immediately mentally as well, because conversation with the HGA is pretty important in moving forward in the craft if you're coming from that background. So Dee not only brought engagement of that conversation back to a priority placement in occultism of his day with his focus on the spiritual, he made sure to record it as well with Edward Kelly for forward projection into the future and into future dialogues and generational knowledge systems, which is something even the greatest magicians can sometimes overlook. I see it happen a lot with those I know, that the value of passing in or passing on, passing forward and back of the information that they're working with when their focus is so on what they are personally doing and perhaps not on how the evaluation of that work that they're doing from different perspectives, past and future historically, could further then inform their workings. We don't always do that. Sometimes we get wrapped up in ourselves. But Dee did look to the past and the future, and he did record. So you'll see in the question that was posted to me on Instagram, which is what this whole video is in response to, why that's important, that he cared and he thought about the past, present, and future. The question I received on Instagram, it's not open to the public, it was a direct message, but it was this wonderful inspiration, a prompter, if you will, to the action of my making this video. In some senses, the person who in the past inquired about this video created it before they even asked the question, right? So past intention manifesting future effects in that sense, which is something that seems very common sense, but if you stop to think about it, is incredible. So It should be mentioned, if we're going to talk about John Dee, which I could talk about forever, at some point I'll have to just do a John Dee and a Monas Hieroglyphica video in itself. But the British Museum's Enlightenment Gallery has a small collection of John Dee's divination tools. And I'll try to include a slide in here somewhere showing them. There are pictures on the internet you can search for it. They tend to not be of the greatest quality because generally only tourists take pictures of them. The supposed showstone of Dee's scryer Edward Kelly is among those objects, and it really is a beautiful example of advanced symbolic inscription work inside occult arts. But to be totally honest, there are better examples, and also examples that are more likely to have been near Dee or Edward Kelly and in their possession. And they exist in private collections that aren't available for public viewing. I mention this for those who are interested in looking deeper into the work and what we have of John Dee's, but I just want to keep everything above board that it also must be pointed out by the academia among us that even those artifacts, those earliest referenced in 1692, there's no actual solid evidence that those magical artifacts themselves have any physical connection to John Dee, that he made them or used them or had anything to do with them. They do look amazing, and they look very much like what is described in Dee's conversations with angels, but there's no real way to have it known if they were actually his tools, his physical objects, or what was given to him or he made with the knowledge of that angelic conversation. He was a known alchemist, though, and he had an annex, a side room of his most used residence. He had quite a few properties. He was very close to a queen for a while when he wasn't in prison because of another queen. But his most used property, where he spent the most time, had an alchemy lab that was full of instruments and astronomical tools, which he called his appendix practical. It was a whole room connected to his library, completely devoted to the alchemical arts, the hermetic arts, and his pursuits in eschatology, the mystical, cosmological orders. Great explorers would come to him for navigation training and expertise, which, of course, back then, that's incredibly important as a skill set to a nation's ability to thrive and trade and find and grow and adapt. He coined the term British Empire in his letters. He was often asked to observe the movements of heavenly bodies. He was one of the best known astrologers of his time for the Queen and her court, the Queen Elizabeth, not Mary, who stuck him in prison once because she was terrified that he could predict the day of her death, which he did. But so he was often asked by Queen Elizabeth to choose or advise on auspicious times due to heavenly bodies to be chosen for all sorts of actions and events. He even chose the Queen's coronation date. Much of this before his work in angelology, which is so often all anyone ever discusses about Dee, his conversations with angels, which were really his transcriptions of Edward Kelly's conversations with angels. But he was a master long before that. He was, in many ways, a genius before he even attended a scholarly, before he began his studies and received his first BA. He started his work into the alchemical at 15 years old. So he very much studied and understood, for instance, the portent of King Arthur, those quests, and that mystical relevance. He actually advised the Queen more than once that she, Elizabeth, could, by divine synchronicities that he read in the stars, she was a Virgo and she was the Virgin Queen, but that within her current lifespan, she could choose to exceed Arthur's golden glories, which it could be argued in many ways she did. It isn't called the age of enlightenment, the golden age, the Renaissance for nothing. It's incredibly likely that some of the claims of artifacts of being his from that room, from the annex within his most used property, were in fact validly his. Although you won't find them in any museum today, they're all privately collected or owned, or one might say protected. So to get to the point, Magus John Dee was dedicated to the origin treatise on the Monas Hieroglyphica of 1664, which must be valued as a very influential and powerful sigil. If you're speaking to me about sigils, this is going to come up, as it contains all the alchemical symbols within it. It contains all symbols within it. So sigil craft work and understanding have to include some aside to this great work. It must be mentioned. He's known to have both said and written that later in life, after writing that treaty, he realized that the symbol itself was a divine prophetic vision, but that only revealed itself to him later, so that he could become aware of its containing even greater mysteries within it than he had conceived of when he first explored it. So, like so much that is ever evolving in the occult, it became known to him in his present, say 20 years later, that what had happened in the past had this much deeper meaning. It was also Dee in 1582 who was asked to investigate and advise Queen Elizabeth, again of the English crown, on whether or not to adopt the new Gregorian calendar. And the person who asked me the question on Instagram, it has to do a great deal with time, linear time. One could say linear time theory, or working with time in the occult. And again, John Dee comes to mind because, he sought to fix time discrepancies. There was a proposal to change the Julian calendar into a Gregorian calendar, because days from each calendar year on the Julian calendar were slowly being lost over time on Christian calendars over hundreds of years spans, because the sun's annual orbit was in fact shorter than recorded calendar years. So the Julian calendar had this flaw that seemed minor, but that built larger over time. And there were basically 10 days missing because of the centuries of the Christian calendar, quote unquote, losing small amounts of time. Pope Gregory, again, the Gregorian calendar, he wanted to change the Julian calendar. He wanted to just remove the extra time for once and for all, just get rid of it. And he proposed, this other new assertion of time and calendar system that really gave a lot of ecclesiastical power. It kept the ecclesiastical dates and time sequence functioning very well, all the high holy holidays. So it was really written on the church's behalf more than anything else. But it did also, ascribe to at least acknowledging that time was going missing, so that some sort of fix, there needed to be some rectification of this issue. Dee, of course, was then asked to advise on this. He basically was asked to decide time for all of us. No small thing, reforming all time into the future. And in doing so, and researching this and preparing what he would say to the Queen, what he would convey, he relied on his occult background, his well-known expertise as a mathematician, math, which he saw as both rational and mystical at the same time, with no division occurring between the two horizons of perception of that science. It wasn't an issue for him. His science background was also in play. The information he gathered from historic recordings across the continents, his astronomical knowledge, he combined all of it in his genius and his, convolution, one might say cohesion or mixing of parts. Again, a polymath of classical, practical sciences, medieval art forms, and divine inspiration, to come to the conclusion that 11 days and 53 minutes exactly ought to be removed from the calendar, that it should be removed as Pope Gregory suggested, but that also this is the exact amount of time that should be removed, leading the world into what he hoped would become a universal reform of time, as it were. to allow for the unification of the people. Because among any other things, he thought politically that it did give ground, in a sense, to the church's belief in the suggested new Gregorian calendar. So in many ways it pleased them. But it did so because the science of the universe itself spoke to that being the correct course of action. So he wasn't just doing it for the church's sake. And it didn't come to pass at all. Despite all of his wonderful advice, resulting in, the massive manifestos that he wrote up, and he gave this huge lecture to the queen and her court. But London, the government decided no, that he was wrong, and it held on to the earlier and very inaccurate Julian calendar, while the rest of the surrounding nation side adopted the fix. The most people went with the new ecclesiastical, suggestion, which dealt very sensibly with the discrepancy and allowed courts of law and churches and those that recorded the natural sciences and things like tax collection and everything else to function well and make sense according to necessary dates. London, however, ignored John Dee and waited centuries to bite the bullet that Dee had proposed and advised. And they took up Greenwich Mean Time, his proposal, far later. The magician was right all along about the need, value, and very real possibility of literally changing the flow of time, which he said as well was going to happen even if it didn't. Again, correct. Something to think about. So, when I even approach certain words like sigilcraft or time magics, when I think of those things, of time and probability and the correspondence between the value of relayed idea and ascended action brought into manifestation by the spell work of the written symbol, letter, or word, I can't help but think of the great exemplar of those things, John Dee. Magic, as we know, especially sigilcraft, is techne, technique. If you go back to the Latin, it's the magic of techne. Everything we do here physically on the manifested plane in ritual, of which any sigil creation is a part, that's a written, manifested physical ritual, that is also, like everything we do here, concurrently occurring on the astral. Especially when we're in ritual, especially when we're focusing on, the manipulation or maneuvering of it. Keeping that in mind, time here, very much like everything else, is an illusory state. It's a manifested state that we are tied to and have to, or have the wonderful joy of. Again, words can carry heavy bias, so I'm trying to be hyper aware of that and how I convey this. But we are tied to this manifested state and need to function here while we're within our physical bodies experiencing the physical. The astral is not a physical manifested state. And so it is not anchored to, if you're in theurgy and you understand the dark, God that is the God of this plane, this all makes sense to you. But the astral is not a physical manifested state. It's not a hell realm on the tree of Malkuth. And so it is not anchored to the illusions, the misconceptions, delusions, artifice, and one of which is linear time. So the astral doesn't have that illusion connected to it, anchored to it, or its effects. Now, you actually mentioned at one point in your comment the sigillum integrum. Just think of the word sigil, but with U's, and then integrum. The seal of a completion, or a sigil fin, this French for finish, the sigil complete. It's just a fancy Latin word for a sigil of completeness. that's a fairly advanced practice that you've hit upon. And that's usually worked with, discovered by, beyond the Zelator ascription and formal hermetic bodies. In my experience, at least with others, that it doesn't usually come up until that threshold is being traversed. Now, that might not always be the case. Like everything in magic, there's always room for the expectation we haven't had revealing itself to wonderfully upset our preconceived conditioning and bias. So I won't say it's always the case. But generally, it's the understanding, comprehension, and then use, even falling into use of the Sigillum Integrum, usually doesn't happen until beyond the Zelator stage, from what I've seen. You wrote, quote, in the rapture of having my desires manifested, I casted a sigil to sort of wrap up the experience nicely. Yes. You've hit on something that is meat for men and not milk for babes, although you might want to begin perceiving that action as actually being inspired by your higher self, your HGA, however you want, to conceive of this and function with it, that it's being inspired by that to take the action by casting your Sigillum Integrum because it was necessary to incorporate now what seems to you to be a past event. So you think you're doing this completion sigil in the rapture of having this unprovoked manifestation manifest, right? But it could be what's going on is maybe without a full comprehension of it, you're actually doing the cast now in the present for what you already received in the past. And that isn't to say that you doing it in the present isn't why you received it in the past. You have to remember, time on the astral doesn't work the same way. So that is your action in the present, which is also manifested on the astral, where again, time doesn't move the same way there. Your action seemingly now created what happened in the seeming past, and the very impulse, that energetic impetus to do such an insightful ritual speaks to that having been necessary in order to have the thing that you already have, come or be the case. Whether or not we can see it that way in linear time. One of the great things about the occult is beginning to understand that you really don't understand anything, and that the illusion that you think you do is part of the problem. From personal experience, many times, which was very confusing for me early on, I should say will be, because it still happens, but a necessitated impulse, say by, I'm trying to think how to phrase this for everyone, my inner dialogue will just suddenly pipe up and say, you need to take this very specific ritual action, at this very specific time, for no apparent reason, or at least none that makes sense. Very much, I'll be walking, say hiking, right? Or walk here down this street, turn left, look up at that window, and push a healing casting or healing pentagram, on that perceived physical space. No one will be in that window. I don't know what's behind that window. I don't even know maybe where I'm standing or why I'm doing it, but I will feel the need to do that for 5 seconds. So I'll be on my way to get a scone, and then for no reason, I'm looking down an empty road, and there's nothing there. No car, no person, maybe not even a mailbox. But then I'm tracing a beneficial, energetic intention in space-time against, catastrophic injurious damage to a human in a car accident. And there's no cars there. So for the longest time, I didn't know why I was doing this. It almost seemed, chaotic. But over time, I've learned to listen to that, again, best way to phrase it for everyone, that inner dialogue. I've learned to listen, right, to my spirit guide, my HGA, however you come about this. And that when I do, even when it seems insane, or even when I disagree, or even when nothing in my mind is going on where I'm standing, that if I just accept it and just do it, it always results in the good, and in a lot of ways, there is no such thing as good or bad. We all have dichotomy within us. Finding balance is the goal. But great men do good things. And you can sense that when you choose certain decisions and processes of journey or path making, and it improves and embetters not only yourself, but those around you. So I've learned to listen. I've learned to just shut up and do what I'm told in a lot of ways, even when it makes no sense to me. Even when I'm maybe casting a sigil onto a street where there are no cars or people at present to slow down blood loss. Over time, I've seen that the culmination of those effects, when they are made known to me later, and they aren't always, but when they are, there always was a purpose. I just didn't know it at the time, if that makes sense. And again, the information of seeing the correspondence play out, that has become more present with experience as well. The more I did it, the longer I was involved, the further I moved within the occult, and you practice these things, the more likely I was to understand, I'm, thinking of the word Volkswagen while doing a, blood loss, retention, because 3 days later there's going to be a car accident here or something along those lines. In the beginning, you're doing it and you don't know why, and it could be something much odder, like much seemingly stranger. Like, I have to pick up this one leaf and move it from here to there or something bizarre that seems so trivial, so meaningless. And yet I just know that when you hear, that internal dialogue, just do it. It never results in the bad. You may never see what it is that you did, but that, part of your movement through the planes and through, ascension process has to do with humbling yourself to things you don't necessarily always understand. And especially if they cost you nothing and are for the good, why on earth, why not? So the more you do it, I'm trying to think of the best way to express this. The more you do it, it's almost like I didn't have the neural net yet when it started happening to me, and I felt very confused by it. I didn't have almost like the synapses firing yet in a way to correspond, even in idea language in my mind, consciously, with the meaning of what was happening or what I felt like I had to do. But later, as those bridges, as those networks, built based on more information and experience of working with them, then it just kind of conveyed into my conscious physical body, my biased physical plane-oriented mind, higher understandings of what I was doing, even if it didn't make sense here in this moment, in ways that make, other plane effects rational or make sense, even when they don't seem rational or make sense here. So there's that. I don't know if you understood half of that, but I did open this, with the much darker meat for men sigil, the beginning logo being, black instead of white, that this was going to be a pretty detail-oriented, more for the adept and less for the neophyte type of video today. So you also discuss how having certain sigil work that you're doing sets boundaries on energies for you. Yes, absolutely. In sigil work, that's a very useful skill to hone. It's actually dangerous not to hone that skill. Obviously, it's nice to be able to close and latch the gate when you even think that there might be a chance that you've errantly left it open in some way. or maybe a better metaphor here is being able to turn off the faucet, right? That you can turn the faucet on and off at will, whether you're filling the bath, while you're filling the bath, so that those waters, don't remain too shallow for them to be of their full usefulness to you, but also so that the level isn't, rising above our head, our ability to function usefully within it. With ritual planetary energy craft, especially if you're into hermetic Western occult magics based on planetary bodies and those vibrations, it's very useful to be able to turn invocated powers on and off. Sometimes we step into a room that's just too much of a rave. It's just too overpowering for us to process and enjoy or make use of. And then when we try to leave, the persistent ravers are following us home to continue the after party that we didn't want to host. That's one way to think of it. On a physical plane working, that can feel like energy bleeding into the future, or connecting past workings into future castings that you don't necessarily want connected, which is what you describe. When you're doing non-physical plane workings, ritual work, it can feel like surges internally, sporadically. This like an effluviance that's uncontrolled or unpredictable, which can interfere with some of our evolution processi. It's not always awesome if you're traveling around the astral to try to do something, say, very specific, which is why you went. But there are other planes beyond the astral as well. You're absolutely correct that, being able to turn it on and off, if it ever feels for any way like it's connecting or flowing in a way you don't want to, it's very important. One of the wonderful ways sigils can be used. And you're absolutely correct that the Goetia includes seals of both angels and demons. And even those descriptors, again, very misleading, dependent completely on our prior conditioning of those words, which are code words. Your description in your comment to me of the structure of chaos magic as applied to sigil work is very perceptive. You've got that one in the bag, as it were. Although use of the word placeholder, I might not use that label, because nothing including seemingly manifested corporal composition holds place. That order or organization which you believe you've constructed or form, later you might experience it in a different way than that. It doesn't hold space necessarily. Nothing ever actually does, even though it all does. It just seems like it's here, or like it here on the physical. It is itself a full and existent experience, not a placeholder for, the desire or even some small access of that one small interpretable facet of the intended outcome that can be reached out and touched, to be operated with, which is what you're doing with sigil magic, even chaos sigil magic. But the actual, existent entity of whatever that energetic form was, desire or other, it was there before, during, and after your operation with it, and always will be and always won't be. Like an item that you collect in a video game. If your character in a video game can, see the little pixels for what they are, like a collectible item, and someone interact with them, and then your little character picks it up and, stores it and has it and can interact with it, but then can choose to use or not to use it for some length of seeming quote unquote time. And then you can put it back down. That little character puts its little item back down on the ground and walks away. And now it seems like it isn't interacting with the character, right? That item that you've set back down. And because in a two-dimensional way, before, you're not now giving it that same expression of connected interaction in your reality. like, let's say it's a sword and you put it back in the stone in your game, and then your character's avatar doesn't have it in that drop down collected weapons inventory menu to access. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't already in that menu, is in that menu, will always be in that menu, and never was in that menu. Or that it won't continue to always be, and be very much connected to you and accessible at any time in any way if your little game avatar only had deeper knowledge of the plane on which it always is, much like your game avatar is, right? That it's always in your hand inside of that moment before you put it down, and you can access that moment. I don't know if any of that makes sense. I don't know if I'm explaining this well. I just know that placeholder, as you use it in your beautiful message to me, just doesn't quite seem to resonate, because nothing's really a placeholder for anything ever. As far as your inquiry into traditional or formalized Enochian schools of thought and practice around sigil work, which is much less of the chaos created typification sigil work, yeah, we do utilize sigils very differently in the Enochian arts, and we don't always make them ourselves. Although early on in our training, we are taught how to make them if we need to, usually by one of the 5 master compasses, how to find the sigils scripturally and then re-manifest them on the physical plane, which is all you're ever doing when you use a master rose. So in that sense, we're all making the same sigil over and over again, fundamentally in that traditional practice, because we're all using the same key to write the spell word or angelic language, name, or symbol. But doing that, learning how to do it, even though you don't have to do it that way later, that not only brings us into contact with vast egregores, and helps us to learn them and learn to access them. It's also, and again, this is a meat for men moment, it's a method of beginning to reveal the authentic power and possibility of symbol, both in depiction and vibratory language. So a mark, say, on an angelic symbol, an angelic name, like the angelic symbol for Raphael's name, on a piece of paper or stone, that has a visual vibration. The sound of the letters, even in English, Raphael, ascribed to, again, it could be whichever alphabet that you're coming from or is being transcripted within a great seal. Those things also have a specific vibration, much like Om. That's a very specific vibration. It's moving, and always has been. Everything always does, but it's also eternal, infinite in its being. Enochian schools, much like other formal hermetic orders, do use specific keys for crafting sigils. And in that way, it's a very different than chaos magic, where you create a sigil, you think seemingly, based entirely on your own mental projections. I think Damien Eccles has a video on this, or maybe more than one, where he actually shows, I believe, a Golden Dawn compass, and explains the method, or maybe he used a Rosicrucian compass, I'm not sure. But he shows the actual steps, kind of the methodology of, like, here's the decoder ring, and here's what that looks like, and how you would then trace any needed name from point to point to create the shape symbol of that vibration. I think he uses a Hermetic Golden Dawn master compass from an Israel Regardie book. I could be wrong, but that method, that is unchanged. Like, that technique of sigil work within the Enochian arts, that's unchanged across many magical platforms, as is the charts created by John Dee and later in the Enochian arts to interact with different entities based on symbolic visual vibrations of specific letters and colors. So that's similar across a whole, spectrum of occult types. even if the language or the timeline or the tradition or the compass used does change, that technique doesn't. Which is why, once crafted, it's going to be that same symbol for that angel with those letters or word sounds attached to it. It's why, the daemon seals of the Goetia are the same daemon seals that Solomon used. It's always going to be that same pictorial, those same word sounds, no matter who draws it. Like within the Tetragrammaton, your comprehension of that, your use of it, your access to its layers, to its powers might change. Your personal vibration might change in correspondence to its energy, or even non-physical visual access to its other dimensional properties and characteristics. Its interpretable nature as a form on different planes might change for you, become more or less accessible. But it's still the same exact non-chaos sigil that everyone uses. Anyone could hand you a copy of that image of the Tetragrammaton, and in one way it is always going to be that same image and that same egregore, that vibration eternal. So yeah, like with angelic seals, there is this traditional non-chaos methodology of sigil work where you're working with sigils that you can remake for yourself, but that already exist. And when you get the technique of that, you also get the technique overall of how those seals can be wrought and opened or closed. And the Goetia doesn't have every entity within it, and neither does the angelic charts of Edward Kelly, for instance. So at some point you may have need of finding others by using the same compass. You aren't wrong about any of that. Not that I have any right or better means than you of judging whether you're right or not, but in a temporal and applied craft sense of what I personally know from my Enochian and Hermetic backgrounds, yes, within the Enochian tradition, within most, if not all, of the higher magical Western occult traditions, what we call high magics, the great work, sigils and symbols have extremely little to do with physical manifestation workings. We don't use chaos magic sigils to, get ourselves, I don't know, a chocolate bar or, a new house or something. I don't know what someone might use that for. Maybe a girlfriend. It seems odd. Maybe a boyfriend. All those things, in a lot of ways, they can be baneful. And sometimes they can be baneful in ways you can't perceive in the moment of your desire for them. So generally not considered high magic. That's sort of the, access to being able to manifest things based on the crafting of energetic forms and perception. That's sort of the milk for babes, physical top layer interpretation and use of symbolic mystery teachings before you start peeling into the nature of ultimate truths, where getting what you may or may not want or desire has nothing to do with anything in magic. Like a child playing with sand at the beach. The kid's just playing with sand, while nearby an alchemist has transmuted it into glass and is observing the light of the sun reflecting from Venus. Right? So same sand, different use. The further you reach, the more there is to reach for. And the more of that impetus force. It almost self-propels in the magics. So the tools become more useful as you gain more insight. I can't get too specific here. You're already aware of why. I know you are. Yes, absolutely, sigils can be created and cast like all magical workings with influence set by intention anywhere, past, present, and future. In the physical, they're constrained by very little, but still, they have very deep meaning for the magus, even though the physical doesn't constrain us very much. You can reach into the past or the future and certainly the present with them. There are many witches and wizards who move through time in more ways than one. And you can easily move through time yourself just by casting, magic in the present to, influence yourself in the past. To perhaps heal or invoke or maybe lessen an effect that had seemingly detrimental consequences to you that already occurred. You can do that. You can visualize yourself into a past space and create a chaos sigil to, aid yourself in something that already happened to you. Like if there was a point in your life that maybe felt very dark or depressing or harmful, or maybe you weren't looking for the higher mysteries, higher knowledge, enlightenment, and you needed to and didn't know it yet back then. You can now reach back. You can cast magic, to strengthen yourself in those past hardest moments, to heal the damage that was being done to you back then, or perhaps to inspire yourself to go seek the enlightenment you've now already been seeking. Done correctly, you will find yourself back in the present, after the completion of your ritual, completely unapologetically aware that you did just give yourself a hand up in what seems to be the past now, but that you went back to help you survive. And that's why you did. It's why you stand here doing this ritual now. It's a difficult thing to explain. If you do it, you'll understand. Because you were always going to come to this point on this perceivable timeline, this energetic facet of incarnation. You were always here already helping you stand back up and survive what happened back then. But it also was absolutely by choice. So really, if you start tracking those lesser publicly known paths inside of the occult, you'll not only start, comprehending that you actually saw yourself astrally standing there in those past moments, maybe at the height of your depression, perhaps casting healing sacred energies onto you, being the only person in that dark room with you, your present self going back to that space, maybe years ago, to be in that room with you where you were maybe weeping or harmed and you felt so alone, and yet for whatever reason knew you weren't, or didn't give up, or got back on your feet, right? Because you went back to that room to be with you, to comfort you, to aid you, to give you the strength that you have now in the present to give to that previous facet of self. So maybe what was just a nothing blur, inside of those past moments, at the edge of the corner of a room, or the shadow you didn't notice because you didn't have the skill set yet to recognize your future self helping you, or maybe you couldn't see it at all. It could be the firmest astral projection in the world, time projection in the world, but if you didn't have the skill then to perceive it, you wouldn't have. But now when you go back, you can know that it was there. And it isn't unimportant to follow through on those actions now. To not follow through on them can weaken what your past self needed, if only because with our perception of time, we have to see it that way. Again, working with time, this is not milk for babes, but if you're working with time on the physical plane, a wonderful place to start is by projecting energy and intention into the past in useful ways. And because what you're doing is you're going to begin formatting in the mind. If nothing else, right? If nothing else comes of it, you will begin creating again those bridges those neuron connections that will allow, the becoming of better, more experienced, your ability to comprehend the sacred language, to hear it, to see it, to be able to translate those vibrations into a comprehensible, perceivable dialect. That's one thing that can be gained just by the practice of going back to help yourself. And that's going to result in the next rung of that causality comprehension ladder. There's so many things I can't say to anyone who isn't there yet because they would sound insane. But once you get there, you won't need them said to you. You'll have this very real understanding of moving in time without moving at all, right? So you begin to realize, one of the things you begin to see with experience is when your future self, right now, from your present self, when your future self is in the room with you, helping you out. Not your HGA, not your higher self, not just your inner dialogue, but literally your future self, your avatar of you from a linear future that doesn't correspond to your immediate presence, that they're standing in the room and, advising you of something, suggesting something, or helping you in some way. Instead of maybe wondering what the heck that low hum is, or the uninterpretable, flash that you saw when you glanced out a window, or that's, I thought I saw a shadow, I got distracted for a second, and I suddenly feel so much better. It's just redirected my mindset or changed the course of my, autonomic, system, or my automatic emotional patterning internally that I was just stuck in a very gross way. And it just kind of flipped that switch, just getting distracted for that second. Instead of just being distracted by that shadow, you might see your future self saying, hey, wake up, right? So it isn't a small thing to be able to start seeing yourself and to appreciate it. Because then the next step does become being appreciative, being grateful for you, helping you, right? Saying, thank you, me, I needed that. It's actually, it's a pretty big leap. And although I'm not going to get into, yet, obviously, yes, there are more paths than time. You brought up time in your comment to me in your sigil work commentary. So that's what I'm discussing. And because I felt this very great impulse to, mention John Dee. But path working not only conforms to time. Generally, we think it has to. We are very conditioned to believe that we have to do things to create effects, right? That action must predispose effect. That labor must be done to build, right? A stone must be stacked on another for the building to be there. That it can't just poof, be a building, right? Training must happen for expertise to be gained. And that's not really the case at all. It's the misconception, right? We all have this misconception of how long, quote unquote, it takes or should take. How long down that linear time road to ascend any ladder, knowledge, magical power, insights of self, building a building, that we have to do work to get somewhere. And that really is a misconception. It can be instantaneous. For many of the great avatars, it is instantaneous. It doesn't require provocation. We just really struggle with allowing for that truth because of how brainwashed we are in the temporal form, how illusioned. And I will for sure include some traditional formal sigil workings, Hermetic, Enochian, the layouts, description of the techne, different uses, not just for, low-level manifestation work and the actual spells playlist of videos that I haven't made yet. But I'll include some that are more in keeping with, a truth seeker of your insight and potential. So it's a playlist I haven't made yet, but I already know I will. In fact, in some ways it already exists. And you probably can access it before I make it if you wanted, or if you quote unquote could, if you allowed yourself to. There are those who can, and I'm sure I know some of them they're very dear to me, and they're already jumping forward that chain, and they're like, oh yeah, cool. And they're hearing me say what hasn't even been recorded to YouTube yet, because it's all there already and they can access it. They're having a time. Next question. Patronus. So what of you is just can't stop thinking about Harry Potter? Which, yeah, that's very much the same effect, right? He thought it was someone else. It was actually him moving through time to aid himself, and he couldn't conceive of that yet because, one, he hadn't taken the labor of doing it, and two, seeing himself as his own best hero was, next to impossible until that humility and evolution became incorporated, and through his alchemical process. So now that that's been addressed, just you're very loud. Next question that I had in Instagram very recently was, why are crows so important to alchemists? So this is why I titled it. I remember I titled the top John Dee and crows. Why are they so attached to the occult? Aren't they a bad omen? So no, in European dogmas, they're perceived as a bad omen now. They were, in a sense, recreated as quote-unquote bad, mostly from European doctrines of Christianity that sought to undermine or move against, again, quote-unquote witchcraft or the pagan occult practices. Mostly because crows were already attached symbolically to the hidden way and to the great work, and they always have been. The crow is a consciousness creation emblem. It was the primary emblem of many Chinese emperors, a symbol of masculine yang energies, that impetus force, that projective force in magics. Again, remember masculine and feminine code words. It all had to do with the number 3, the crow. I believe in the Chinese emblems, the imperial emblems, it had 3 legs and stood inside the sun or near the sun or within the horizon of the sun. And each leg was a correspondence to the solar cycle: dawn, noon, dusk. And those 3 sun manifestations are very much in connection to the alchemical heavenly 3 elements, those which made Hermes the thrice great, the same elements that Balana sought to refine at dawn, noon, and dusk. The crow is black. That's very important. That's an incredibly important color to the occult. Every occultist would know that. Where, all neos, all neophytes are born from the darkness, or brought forward from it, or pulled from it by those that would raise us beyond it, right? The phase of the physical blindness, death, that great abyss that we climb out of, that earth, terra, darkness that we are clawing our way up through, the profane that we are, finally escaping. Long ago, early alchemists began to perceive what corvids actually could do, because they were more perceptive of, the animal forms, as they are of most sciences than most of the public. Just how much of a mental creature corvids were, ravens, crows, that their consciousness was a great secret, and that most were completely oblivious to the fact that they had problem-solving skills. Crows have problem-solving skills. They had it generations ago. They could think for themselves. They used tools better than any other bird, most any other creature, and mimicked language in a magical way. Very much have their own language for those who can see it, that they could seek, that they could find, that they could convey. They could perform necessary tasks. And even their loud call was seen in ancient times to be a call to find true consciousness, like almost as if they were calling out to help you, escape the illusion of the non-subconscious planes, which if you go far enough back in Egypt, you had a similar thing with the baboons screaming at dawn, right? That call to consciousness, almost seeking to communicate with us. In a lot of ways, the crow was seen to be trying to rise above or transcend their state, their consciousness state, as just familiars, as just pets, and to pull themselves out of that realm of earthly beasts into a higher level of consciousness, such as man already had, which of course, that's going to be a big deal to the alchemist. Witches knew that they grieved, that crows and ravens grieve their dead, and that they also, could make judgment calls, emotionally based judgment calls. They would hate individuals within a flock that didn't behave well, or they would kill them. That's no small thing. And it's something science is only beginning to even discuss or appreciate now, right? The Vikings knew that, crows could deliver messages. They had a huge connection to the subconscious in the occult traditions there, in the Norse mythologies, that they brought gifts, often shining gold gifts. Again, that's going to convey symbolism to the alchemist. Woden's crows, Hunin, Moonin, crows of wisdom. Native Americans, the totem of the great crow, that force of the universe which civilizes, which means it has the ability to think beyond its own instinctual desires. So when you see the black crow, it is emblematic of the, profane, which we all strive to take wing of in the occult arts. Say like the third-eyed raven in a very popular series that ran not so long ago. Again, the number 3, like the three-legged crow of the Chinese emperors. That's the raven of alchemy. The 3 stages of calcination, dissolution, separation, the great message bringer, resulting in essence and outcome, true self-consciousness, right? That result of becoming truly conscious, in a sense. It's a process, and it's there symbolically in the crow, in the raven, in the number 3. There's so much more to all of that, but you say, why is it so important, and is it a bad thing? Hopefully I've given you some sort of an overview of, why it's now misperceived because of certain doctrines as a bad omen, because it was so symbolically powerful and wonderful, and still is, and that's why it's so attached to the magics. That's why that symbol of the crow is still attached to magic so deeply. Hopefully that's enough of a starting point for you to dive deeper, to delve into from further if you wish to. So yes, it's a very, very important symbol in magic, and I have been going on and on for so long because I've been waiting to do this video for so long. I hope I've addressed some of what the person who asked me about sigil work brought up, and I will definitely come back to this topic in the future. And just before I close, there isn't a day that goes by, that someone doesn't thank me for the videos or find them useful in some way, or it doesn't say something about something in the occult to me, even if it isn't an inquiry, but just, a comment of some kind that just it can bring such great, inspiration that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to. Because it really is, as you all know, it's a give and take. And thank you. Thank you for existing, for being here in every moment throughout time, where we've always been. And thank you for being just amazing. I love you all. Until next time.